It moved across the ice like a living thing, a patient animal with a mouthful of snow, licking at the canvas of the field hospital, worrying the seams, pawing through any weakness a human hand had left. It made the floodlights quiver, turned breath into steam and steam into small crystals that drifted down as if the sky itself were shedding. Sergeant Jonah Hale watched it move across the ruined forest, what the locals had called a singing wood before the bombardments, and tried not to think about all the voices that would never sing again. He saw the shape in the drifts before the drone did, a color that didn't belong, not the black-green of churned earth or the slate of shattered granite, not the dull gray of frost-burned bark. Pale, too pale. He raised a gloved fist and his squad bled to a halt, the way only people who have done long frost marches together can. Snow hissed across their boots. The last light was folding itself into the trees, violet in the east, iron in the west. Contact, Corporal Tashi breathed. Maybe. They fanned out, weapons down but not away. The wind tried again, gnawing at the gaps between plates, sneaking icy teeth down collars. Jonah moved ahead, one step too, and the drone's little lens flickered, finding it too. The outline sharpened as the drift released its hold. A figure tucked into a hollow of collapsed snow and spent heat, shoulders bare, hair braided tight and pale as the ground. Frost traced filigree across her skin like someone had painted prayers there and asked the night to bless them. Tashi knelt first, professional, careful, no sudden motions. Alive. The pulse under the jaw was a small bird, faint, fluttering, unwilling, and stubborn. Alive, Tashi said, and then he was shrugging off his pack and hands were moving the way hands learned to move after too many campaigns. Heat sheet, micro heater. A soft curse when the wind tried to carry the warmth away, and then the foil was cocooned, and then the figure shivered violently like a machine fighting a seizure, and a sound came out of her like a torn piece of thread. Jonah was already unwinding his blanket, not the standard issue, his own. It had lived in his pack since the border wars, folded around coffee tins and stubborn memories, carrying the smell of smoke no detergent could entirely chase. He'd shared it with a dying pirate once, with a child who'd lost an arm in an airlock accident, with a partner who left for a planet with lower gravity and a higher chance of forgetting. It had seen more stars than some ships. He wrapped it around her shoulders. It looked enormous on her, swallowing the white gold braids, the thinness of a body that had been cold too long. Her ears were delicate, tapering to points under frost. Someone had woven bright thread through the braids, blue and silver, the colors of snow shadow and moonlit ice. Her eyes opened all at once. They were so blue they made him forget the wind. The pupils were needle-thin in the glare of the squad lamps, and in the blue a history lived, broken into sharp shards, ships falling like shooting stars, the sky burning and then freezing, a city built around something that sang in the ground, a people who'd learned the sound the snow makes when it remembers. She looked from face to face, from the human suspension of breath to the human way of not touching a stranger first. Then she looked down at the blanket around her, and as if she had to relearn the articulation of mouth and tongue, she whispered, The wind tried to devour the rest. Jonah leaned closer, the heat from his own suit making vapor curls between them. I'll remember, she finished. I'll remember this. Her voice had the bright clarity of ice cracking. It found places inside Jonah he thought the war had milled smooth. He nodded like he understood. He didn't. Not yet. Back at the camp under the canvas that fought the wind and yielded and fought again, they learned her name was Ina. Not from her mouth. The sound she gave them when Tashi coaxed water between her lips were crystalline, vowel-rich, and some of the trackers from 3rd Platoon, who'd spent a season mapping this planet before the fall, said it meant one who knows the river under the ice. Ina was Aevril, the field reports said, not an enemy, collateral. The Dominion had moved through this valley looking for a buried relay, a relic from wars older than humans among the stars. The Aevril had kept the secret for generations, singing to the stone that covered it. The Dominion's dogs had smelled the truth anyway. Everything else that had a voice burned, fled, froze, or pretended never to have sung. Jonah tried not to think about songs when he looked at the frost patterns on Ina's skin. They looked intentional. In the light, they stared as if they were eyes. She wore them the way soldiers wore scars, not decorations, not shame, history in relief. She didn't ask for much. She accepted water as if it were an honor, sipped from the heat cup as if it were a story shared. She slept holding one edge of the blanket as if someone might try to take it back. There were other survivors, a handful found under collapsed beams, a child with hands too burned, a man whose leg remembered a trap even after they removed the metal. The humans did what humans do when everything beyond the camp line is wrong. They built small right things and huddled around them. A soup line that never emptied, a circuit of warming lamps whose power budget Tashi juggled and juggled until he slept with numbers twitching behind his eyelids. A wall of names written in grease pencil on a ration crate because no one could bear to forget any more voices. The signals officer, a woman named Mora, pieced together the story with the patience of someone who has sat too long in too many silences. The Dominion had wanted the relay. They had found it, half unearthed it like a fossil, and then something in the mountain had shaken its head and swallowed them whole. The survivors who'd seen said the snow had risen like water and the ice had sung a sound like a blade being pulled across glass for the length of a breath and no longer. "We should leave," the major said over the secure channel. "Collect what we can. Mark coordinates for the next sweep. There are other valleys, other survivors." Jonah was standing outside the tent flap watching Ina's breath. It didn't steam now. She'd recovered heat too quickly for someone who'd been almost frozen. When Mora finished with the major, she asked the question without looking at him. "You think we should stay?" "I think this planet is telling us something," Jonah said, and he didn't mean it in any way that a sensor could record. He meant the way the wind tugged at things, the way the snow settled, the way Ina's eyes held them one by one for a heartbeat, as if measuring whether they could learn to hear what she heard. "Transports are 3 days out," Mora said. "Rations for 5, flares for 2 nights. The Dominion has long range in the upper atmosphere. They'll come back with heavier boots and worse manners." Jonah nodded. He knew the math. He'd been doing it since he was old enough to watch grown men count body bags and call it logistics. "We stay 2 nights," he said. "We listen." Listen to what? He looked at the blown line of trees to the north, where the wind had piled snow into dunes like ocean waves, and at the mountain beyond them, dark and old. To anyone who's still speaking. That evening, under the dim greenhouse glow of power-saving lamps, the Aevril survivors began to hum. It started with the burned man. He stirred in the corner where Tashi had settled him, and the hum came out involuntarily like breath squeezed by a harness. A high note, then a lower, like a thing remembering where to place its feet. The child picked it up without thinking. 2 notes became 5. 5 became a slow pattern like the rhythm of a walker's gait, like the crunch of snow under boots. Ina's own voice joined last, so quietly that Jonah almost missed it in the murmur of wind against canvas. When it folded in, the hairs stood on his arms despite the suit. Something old ran under those notes. "Hold on," Mora whispered, lifting her recorder, but Jonah shook his head. "Not yet," he said. He didn't know why. He just knew not to make this into data. The hum thickened the air. The lamps vibrated gently, a sympathetic movement, or maybe Jonah's hands did. Outside, the wind found the seam in the canvas again, made it snap like a pennant. The snow hissed as if answering. Ina opened her eyes. In the drifting bluish light, they looked less like gems and more like deep water right before a storm. She gestured for Jonah. Frustration tightened her mouth when speech failed. She used her hands instead, tracing a line in the air like a river, then tapping the ground and then her chest. She said a word. It sounded like the clink of ice cubes meeting, like a chime hung from a broken eave. River, Jonah guessed. She nodded, breathed relief, and then drew a series of arcs, one under another, like buried domes. Her fingers shook. She frowned at them as if they hadn't shaken in other winters. She pointed to the north. Then she wrapped her hands around the blanket again, knuckles showing white through her almost translucent skin. "Okay," Jonah said softly. "North, river under the ice, domes, you need us to follow." Her mouth made shapes. She tried 2 words and gave up and settled for a look the way a soldier settles into a new trench at 3 in the morning. Not resigned, not pleased, simply committed. "We have transports in 3 days, Mora said when Jonah told her. "And a major who will remind you you're not a scout anymore. There's a procedure for—" "I know the procedure," Jonah said. "And I'm sick of procedures surviving better than people." Mora looked at Ina, then at the wind. She had been with Jonah long enough to see how he behaved when he'd already made a decision. She sighed like a woman stepping into cold water. "It's your rope," she said, and then more gently, "I'll tell the major you're scouting safe extraction routes." "Thanks. You better make some." They moved before dawn. The stars were like pins through black cloth. The horizon bruised and then blued and then tried for silver. Tashi pushed a sled ahead of them layered with everything the major would hate to lose. Flares, medkits, 2 field stoves, the rolled skeleton of a comms dish that Mora had sworn under her breath while she disassembled it. Ina moved within the blanket, smaller than the human gear, but when she placed her bare hands to the snow to steady herself, Jonah saw the frost patterns shine. "The river," she whispered once almost to herself. The word had grown easier in the human mouth. "The underriver, if it hears us, it will help." "What is it?" Tashi asked, not unkindly. "Not water." Ina shook her head minutely. "Memory," she said, and Jonah felt something in his chest thread itself into the morning air. They approached the broken forest. The trees here were as tall as towers and as thin as poles, with branches like long fingers that held the wind and then let it go. In the hush between gusts, the hum from the night before seemed to hover, a held note barely audible. Ina stopped. She placed one hand flat on the snow. Her lips moved. Her breath didn't fog. "It's too cold for that," Jonah remembered. Too cold for almost anything human. The first sinkhole was invisible until it opened. Tashi's boot went in and kept going. He swore reflexively and threw himself back. The sled juddered forward. Jonah and Mora grabbed ropes by instinct. The hole widened the way a mouth widens in a scream, and then stopped abruptly like a mouth that's thought better of it. The sled skidded to the lip and hung there, and then, with the kind of irritated hop only inanimate objects make, it slid in and vanished silently. Easy. Jonah's heart slammed so hard the world blurred, he blinked until it settled. The wind watched them suffer, polite, distant. "Underriver," Ina said softly, apologetically, as if she had hoped it had moved somewhere else. "Is it going to eat us next?" Mora asked, calculating. Angry because angry was easier than frightened when the world opened its throat under you. Ina frowned at the snow, then shook her head. She crouched, the blanket pooling around her like a pet. She made the hum again. No words, a pattern. The wind paused. Jonah would have sworn the sky leaned down. The snow hardened, not everywhere, not on command, but a path outlined itself an arm-span wide, winding away into the trees like a fragment of bone revealed through scraped flesh. Ina stood, swayed, and then set her feet on that path as if it were the only trustworthy thing in a dishonest world. "Follow exactly," Jonah said into his mic. His throat was dry. "Step where she steps." They did. They crossed places where the snow still laughed at them, collapsing an inch, a breath, then solid again. They passed the marks of old heat, circles burned into bark, stones cracked by a temperature change so sudden it had been an insult. They passed a place where someone had set up a little shrine of river stones fused by lightning, a ring of bone white where snow refused to lie. Ina didn't look at any of it. She watched the ground like a lover watches a sleeping face for an eyelash twitch, a breath snag. After an hour, they crested a rise and saw the valley. It looked like a city that had been buried by a careful hand. The domed arcs Ina had drawn last night were there in the snow, gentle humps in patterned lines. When Jonah squinted, he saw that the snow lay differently there, fine as sifted sugar, as if the wind had agreed not to rough it. Out of one of the humps, a sliver of metal gleamed. Haloed frost made it look holy. "The relay?" Mora asked. "No," Ina said quietly. "Home." Her hand trembled when she pointed. Jonah saw the tremor and felt anger flare, sudden and inappropriate and very human, wanting to tear the world to find the thing that made an Avril's hand shake. He swallowed it. Anger was a tool. Tools belonged on belts. "How do we open it?" Ina looked at him, surprised. She had expected him to ask whether they should. She moved forward, not on the path now, but as if she trusted this place so deeply even the Underriver wouldn't dare get it wrong. She pressed her palm to the snow above one of the domes. The frost patterns brightened. She sang. It was not a pretty sound. It wasn't meant for ears. It shook Jonah's teeth and made Mora wince and made Tashi shut his eyes like someone remembering a time the wind took a friend. The sound went down into the snow like a spear thrown into water, and for a beat the valley held its breath. Then the dome sighed and the snow slid away from itself. A seam appeared and widened like a yawn. Breath, warmer than the air, came up, smelling faintly of iron and old leaves. They went down. The passage was narrow, then generous, then narrow again, the way many things made by hands are. The walls were glazed with ice and cut with symbols. The lamps cast the humans as long-shadowed figures with coal for eyes. Their exhales feathered the walls and froze, adding another translucent word to the story. The passage widened into a chamber. It wasn't empty. Nothing this old and this tended is ever empty, but there were no bodies, no movement. There were tables with bowls carved from transparent stone. There were bent places in the floor where feet had gone too many times. At the room's heart, there was a pillar that had been polished until it could hold an entire person's reflection. Ina went to it like people go to water. She pressed both hands flat on the pillar and closed her eyes. The frost patterns on her skin brightened until they looked like blue-white tattoos. The pillar brightened too, not glowing, more like it began to remember itself and return to clarity. Jonah, standing close enough to see his own face in it, a face he always thought looked competent, tired, more than half invisible, saw more than his face. He saw the floodplain in summer grass. He saw children and elders and hands weaving thread through hair. He saw a time when the sky didn't fear ships. He saw Ina as a child, fingers clumsy, learning where to place a note so the Underriver would listen. Ina was crying. The tears didn't freeze on her cheeks. They left shining trails. She was not sobbing, not shaking. The tears were as quiet as the blanket she had accepted with trembling hands. "What do you need?" Jonah asked, and it felt like the right question and also the only one. She looked at him, startled again by his word choice. She didn't say, "I need you to leave," or "I need vengeance," or "I need your ships." She looked at Mora, then at Tashi, then at the pillar and said simply, "To carry." "Carry what?" She pressed her palms harder into the stone. The pillar answered. A tone filled the chamber, like the hum from the night before, but deeper, older, a bass note the world had been tuned around. The tone went up through the ceiling. Jonah felt it in his teeth and in the scar that ran across his left knee from a training accident, felt it in the places in him that didn't respond to orders or medals, but responded to a child tripping on gravel. The Underriver answered, a hush coming up through the floor that was somehow louder than sound. "You want us to carry this," Mora said slowly. "The memory." Ina nodded. "It will die," she said, and now her voice did shake, "if no hand is warm enough to hold it. Our hands," she looked at her fingers, as if remembering frostbite from a different day, "are fewer." Jonah looked at the pillar and saw 1,000 small, ordinary things and a few that were not ordinary at all. He saw the relay the Dominion had wanted as a black shadow behind glass, a wedge of ancient tech embedded deep in the mountain like a thorn in thick flesh. He saw the Aevril choose to live around it, to make its presence into a song, to keep the thorn from festering. He saw the Underriver, a network of capillaries of memory and heat that threaded the mountain, something that might have been life and might have been the illusion of life. And he saw the Dominion strike at the memory because they could not be bothered to extract the thorn carefully, and the Underriver rise in rage like blood-made weather and swallow them and everything near. He understood enough. "Show us how," Jonah said. "They didn't have enough time. They never do, that's the human truth." But the Underriver seemed willing to pause its breathing while Ina taught them the notes. The humming became chanting, the chanting fell into rhythm. Mora, whose voice had never been asked for anything other than orders and copy, found the lower register and held it like a wall. Tashi, who had grown up in a house that had sung only on holidays, found a harmony by accident and then grinned with his eyes in disbelief. Jonah listened and replaced himself where he fit best, like a hand filling a glove that had been waiting for him. When they surfaced from the long lines of sound, the sky had turned a thin, treacherous blue. Their lungs felt rinsed. Their mouths tasted like metal. Ina's face looked less thin. The frost patterns on her skin had softened, shifted. Their edges didn't look so brittle. "We need to get back," Mora said, squinting up the passage. "Tell the Major we're staying one more night whether or not he likes it." "He won't," Jonah said. "He'll live," Mora said, and then with a glance at Ina, "We will too if this Underriver thing likes us." They reached the surface to find that the world had not slept. The Dominion's dogs were on the horizon, a spatter of gray shapes moving with purpose. Above them, a pale smear in the sky told of heavier things inbound. "Move," Jonah said, and his voice shed the gentleness it had been wearing like a borrowed coat. "Back to camp. We'll lead them away." Ina picked up the corner of the blanket that had dragged behind her and folded it over her shoulders like a cloak, an action at once practical and ceremonial. She looked at the dogs without fear. She looked at Jonah and gave him a word in Aevril like a gift. "What does that mean?" he asked. She mimed placing something warm in her chest. "You keep for me," she said, and then because humans like to make sure things mean what they need them to mean, she added, "Please carry." "We will," Jonah said, and then they ran. The day roared. The Dominion had learned to move over this snow without becoming its meal. Their boots spread weight. Their machines radiated a kind of null heat that tricked the Underriver into ignoring their trespass. But the Underriver doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive when you bruise it repeatedly. Jonah and his team ran point and sang, not loudly, not like the chanting under the dome, but the small hums and grunts of effort that spend themselves in breath. The Underriver listened. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. That's the nature of old things. Jonah learned to accept it, bargain with the wind instead. By the time they reached the first canvas of the human camp, the dogs were close enough to smell. Not literal dogs, though that would have been easier. These were men in powered suits whose faces were hidden behind mirrored plates. The plates reflected the snow and made them look as if they were wearing the world as a mask. They moved with the ugly grace of men who aren't thinking about the ground past where their boots go. The suits whispered. The rifles asked questions that only ended one way. Positions, Mora snapped but softly. The wind would carry a shout a long way. "Tashi with me. Jonah, get the Aevril into the big tent. Keep the heaters low. We'll make them see more tents than there are." "How?" Jonah asked, not because he doubted her, but because he liked to be impressed in the last 10 seconds before a bad thing happened. It made life easier to deliver to oneself. Mora lifted a handful of flares and a roll of reflective filament and smiled a thin smile at the wind. "By lying," she said. "They lied well. Humans had been lying to predators since the first one stared at fire and thought about meat. Lying to a suit's sensors was not so different. Flares thrown in arcs, filaments hung on poles so the wind made them shimmer like heat plumes, a stutter of signals that the Dominion's dogs would be embarrassed to admit had fooled them later. The dogs split. 3 went left, 4 right, 2 straight ahead. That sort of split is always a small hope. It means the enemy isn't listening as hard as they should. Ina watched it happen, the blanket around her shoulders. The child from the previous night tucked his hand into hers. He had learned this grab from human children. She looked down at him with honest astonishment, then squeezed. The dogs came. 3 against the decoy tents burned hot and empty. 2 fell into holes the Underriver remembered at the last moment for them. The rest wavered and swung like a compass needle, almost finding north. Jonah waited until the last possible heartbeat. Then he stood in the open, where the wind could see him. He held nothing in his hands but the blanket he had given and then given again. He held it up like a flag. "Over here," he said. The wind made him a liar and a truth-teller both. The dogs turned, rifles lifted, muzzles black as endings. Jonah heard Tashi swear. He heard Mora say something affectionate to her rifle. He heard the child suck breath from the air and attempt to hide his heartbeat in his own small mouth. The Underriver sighed, not once, not jazz. A long, low, patient sigh that started under Jonah's feet and moved outward like a creature stretching after a long sleep. A ripple moved through the snow too slow to register as danger until you thought about it later. The dogs took 2 steps forward and stopped. A line had formed in front of them, a line drawn with a giant nail. On this side, snow promised by path. On that, the place where the world had been swallowed once and might be again. "Come on," Jonah said softly. He didn't shout. Shouting is a confession that you aren't sure you're right. The dogs looked at the line. They had their orders. They could picture their officers' faces. They had all the reasons men already pressed into action need. But they also had instincts older than their rifles that told them the ground just ahead would be very disappointed in their feet. Over the secure channel, Mora was laughing. One of those laughs you do quietly in your throat because you're not sure you're allowed the joy. "We could make them go home with a line," she said. For a little while, Jonah replied. The while lasted long enough to get the survivors into the big tent and the comms dish up, and the sound beamed into the kind of sky that could carry memory a long way. It lasted long enough for Ina to sing the last notes into the pillar's echo, long enough for the Underriver to exhale its ascent. It did not last long enough for the heavy ships in the upper atmosphere to decide this wasn't worth their time. Transports on approach. The Major's voice croaked into Mora's earbud. "You lit up half the mountain. The Dominion lit up the other half. Get those civvies packed now." Mora's mouth tightened, but her hands moved faster, stowing coils, locking cases. Tashi knelt and laced a kid's boots tighter than the kid liked. Jonah stood in the door of the big tent, felt the wind make the canvas slap his shoulder, and watched the heavy ships show their gray bellies. "We don't have space for all of them," the Major said when the transports broke through the cloud like blunt miracles. We don't have enough." Jonah had known that. He had seen the ships, he had seen the numbers. He had counted his breath to keep his anger occupying its proper house, close to his ribs where it belonged, not out in his hands where it could make him do irreversible things. He turned to Ina. He didn't have to ask. She shook her head. "I stay," she said. "We stay some, you go." "Carry." "Then what?" Tashi asked, pulling straps tight on an old man who had fallen asleep sitting up from sheer cellular exhaustion. "We leave you, we come back." Ina thought about how to put it the way you think about the last piece of bread when there are too many mouths. She placed a hand on Jonah's blanket, then placed that hand on her own chest. "You will carry," she said. "That is the coming back." It wasn't enough. It was also everything. The first transport took the child and the burned man and a clutch of others who couldn't move quickly, their lives threaded together by straps and whispers. The dogs at the edge of the world watched the line and didn't cross, one of them trembling as if the suit had understood and the man inside hadn't. The heavy ships changed their flight pattern like thoughts changing subjects. The second transport took the equipment that would let memory travel. Not all of it. There was too much Aevril for any human ship to uplift in a day, but enough to tilt a ledger in the right direction, enough for a start. Last run, the Major said, "Pick your team." Jonah looked at Ina. There was no point in lying, not to her, not to his own bones. "I'm staying," he said. Tashi looked at him as if Jonah had pulled a small trick out from behind his ear. "Of course you are," Tashi said mildly. "Because your talent for reasonable decisions is legendary." "Someone has to hold the note," Jonah said, and in his mic he heard Mora snort like a woman who had seen 100 good men turn into metaphors at inopportune times. "I'll stay too," Mora said before he could forbid it. "You'd make the wrong face at the wrong second, Hale. Someone has to keep you pretty." "Flatterer." "Cow." Tashi closed his mouth around the words he wasn't going to say. He said instead, "Don't die dumb," which is the kind of love soldiers know how to afford. The second transport took off. Snow whirled around it, a blizzard made of noise and powder. The wind drove the powder into the dogs' plates, making them look like ghosts. The heavy ships angled lower, shadows tasting the ground. "Let's see if old things like or hate rockets," Mora said. The answer was not simple. It never is. The Underriver didn't hate rockets, it hated arrogance. The heavy ships didn't hate old things, they hated complications. The old thing under the mountain and the arrogant men in the sky negotiated in the language of pressure differentials and harmonics. The ground sang. The ships trembled. The winds, who had been watching all this with great interest, participated by doing as they pleased. The first bombardment fell short, not by error but by calculation. A warning to the transports to hurry, to the dogs to forward, to the old things to be less troublesome. The second bled heat into the snow in a pattern that made the Underriver mutter in its sleep. The third carved a square into the valley because sometimes the human desire for straight lines infects even the enemies of humans. Ina stood beside Jonah in the tent door. She had stopped shivering some time ago. Her eyes were desert calm, as if she had seen sand. She pressed the blanket's edge into his hand. "Carry," she said again to him and to what he represented. "If you live." He wanted to promise. He said instead, "We'll endure." "Endure," she repeated carefully, as if discovering how the syllables sat next to each other. The Dominion's dogs, perhaps bored by the line or perhaps shamed by it, finally tried the thing cowardice always tries. They went around. They found a place where the line blurred and an unkind slope led toward the back of the tent and the edge of the Aevril's dome. 2 came, then 4. Mora looked at Jonah and then dropped a flare, and the filament she had strung earlier sprang into a false fire that made the dogs think the ground there was hot, and one stepped into the wrong patch. The Underriver rolled over that boot like a tongue tasting something poisonous. Jonah heard the suit whine. He heard a human curse, short and fine-edged and promptly swallowed by the helmet. The suit yanked. The ground considered. The dog came free and left a piece of pride behind. "Maybe they'll go home," Tashi whispered over the channel from the transport as it lifted. "Tell stories about the ground." "Maybe," Mora said and leveled her rifle. "The Dominion didn't go home. The Dominion never goes home when there's a ledger unbalanced." But they hesitated, and that hesitation opened a door for another sound. It began below thought, under the Underriver, in bedrock. Jonah felt it before he heard it. His knees did a small, sympathetic bend. His hands tightened on the blanket like someone bracing on a rail as a ferry lurches. The Aevril in the tent looked up in unison and began to hum without telling each other to. The note rose. It braided itself around the humming Jonah, and Mora had learned and made it thicker, stronger. It braided itself around the fear and made that thicker, then diluted fear with respect. The heavy ships altered their descent. Instruments soldered in perfect laboratories made suggestions to men whose fingers had calluses negligible compared to Ina's frost patterns. The men chose to disregard a few of those suggestions and listen to others, because human or dominion, men will do what makes sense to them in the moment plus their portion of folly. The ships fell, not crash, not intended landing, something in between, far from the tent, far enough to end the day's rush, close enough to promise the war would not end today. Transports out of atmosphere, the major said, voice thin with distance. We'll be back when the big boys give up for the night. Hold, for the love of every saint who survived burn-in, hold. Jonah relaxed a knot he hadn't known he had. He looked at Mora. They were both grinning. They were not safe. They were not saved, but for a few breaths, not everything demanded. They could measure time in something else. They moved the Aevril back into the dome. They sang until their voices turned from sound to suggestion. They took turns sleeping the way people do when the night is crowded with the possibility of waking. When Jonah slept, he dreamed of deserts cooling at night, of sands that remember the day's footprints and then decide they prefer their own patterns. When he woke, he found Ina awake, hand on the pillar, the frost patterns altered again, softer still. He took the blanket back from her shoulders to lay it over two children who had curled together like parentheses. Ina watched with a look reserved for rituals she recognized. The bread broken by steady hands, the water held to lips, the opening and closing of a door to keep a wind from someone sleeping. She did not reach to stop him, did not clutch at the blanket as if a gift could be stolen back. She said, "You carry," as a blessing and a command that both considered each other equals. In the gray before the second dawn, the Dominion tried again. They had learned something and forgotten something, as armies do. They learned where the line softened. They forgot the weight of stories. They came with more dogs, fewer heavy ships, and men who had told themselves they would not be made fools by snow. Jonah met them at the line. He did not raise a weapon. He had one. He wore it. He did not raise his hands, because that would have meant he wanted something other than what he wanted. He raised his voice. "Turn around," he said. The dogs in front stopped by command. Someone far behind tapped a control, and the suits responded. The one in the front was the one whose boot the Underriver had tasted the day before. He tilted his head, and Jonah saw his own face reflected in the plate, a ghost made of snow and blood and other people's memory. He hated these men as one hates the fact of aging or rust, because they were unnecessary and inevitable because they always came. He loved them the way a human is asked sometimes to love an enemy, because hating them was a way to become a machine, and he had not survived this long to turn into an appliance. "Turn around," he said again. The dog tilted his head further in the gesture of a man indulging a child. Then he stepped over the line. The ground took his foot. Not to the shin, not to the knee, only ankle deep like a farmer checking a field. He jerked. He wrenched the foot back. The ground sighed like a teacher disappointed. He lifted the rifle. Ina's voice came then, not loud, pure. A single note like a thread cast by a weaver thrown across a room to be caught by another hand. It passed Jonah, he caught it, he threw it to Mora. It went treeward and tentward and domeward and frostward. The Underriver followed as if reminding itself of a path from long ago. The line brightened, not light, a crispness that was visible, a boundary sketched by a careful pencil, a drawn breath waiting for someone to decide whether to laugh or cry. "Turn around," Jonah said for the last time. He felt the story open its mouth. The dog's rifle stuttered. A single shot. It took a hole out of the snow a meter from Jonah's boot. The wind snapped it up like a treat given to a well-trained beast. The dog tilted his head that indulgent fraction more, then nodded, a gesture that meant something and nothing. He stepped back behind the line. He turned. He walked away. The others did. The Underriver loosened its shoulders. When they were gone, Jonah sagged and discovered that he had not been breathing, because sometimes bravery means forgetting the function of lungs. Mora put a hand on his back and pushed a breath into him like a friend. None of the awkwardness humans put between themselves when they think too much about propriety. They held. The transports returned with night's cover and courage as fuel. They lifted more heavier, then dipped lower and threw out packages that unfolded into shelters, heaters, pods big enough to move pillars if pillars needed moving. The Major came down with them, face raw and relieved and furious in equal measures, the way a good officer's face is supposed to be when his people have not done as ordered and everyone is somehow not dead. "Explain," he demanded, and then with a glance at Ina softened the word so it didn't insult the wind. They explained. Ina spoke in pieces. Mora translated in frames. Jonah stitched it together with the kind of thread you don't buy at any supply depot. The Major listened and swore and then put his hand on the pillar because he had to see for himself. When he saw, he stepped back like a man who has discovered God and found him inconvenient. "Fine," he said, "we carry." They did it the way humans always do, with too little grace and too much heart, arguing and singing and bleeding and laughing when laughter made the wind pause. They moved the memory, some of it, as much as could be lifted without tearing, into places that had never asked for it but would do. They took the Aevril who would leave and left those who would not. They built a shelter that could go and a story that would stay. They wrote the names again, this time on a portable wall that would not belong to any one valley. They put the frost patterns on their own skins, not with needles, but with the pressure of their palms against cold surfaces, until the memory took the shape of a hand extended. On the last day, when the sun decided not to give them light as if it had found a better use for the sky, they gathered at the edge of the dome. The wind had learned their names. It made a softer sound. The dogs were gone, perhaps elsewhere, perhaps learning to lie to new ground. The heavy ships watched from a distance that said later, in a tone Jonah recognized from his mother's voice when he dropped a cup, and she'd known there was another clay one in the cupboard. Ina stood. She had taken the blanket and woven into its edge a strip of blue and silver thread. She placed it on Jonah's shoulders, folded it as if he were the kind of man who wore robes. She pressed her hand to his arm where the frost patterns had once seemed like hard flowers. Her skin was warmer now. Her tears didn't freeze, she didn't shake. "I'll remember," she said, completing the sentence she had begun in the snow the first time he saw her. "I'll remember you." "Remember yourself more," Jonah replied. "And your river." "Our river," she corrected, and it was not appropriation but an invitation. They lifted. The transports took memory like cargo and like fire and like disease capable of catching. The sky swallowed them and then returned them to different horizons. The story didn't end because stories worth telling don't. They move houses. The Dominion learned the wrong lesson in the adjacent valley and paid for it in equipment and men and a sliver of pride. It would take a long while for them to learn the right one. The Underriver slept and woke and slept, as old things do when they know the world will outlast men and sips cold air accordingly. Jonah carried the blanket through too many stations and too many briefings and one delightfully obscene bar on a station built at an angle that made everyone feel as if their bones were slightly misaligned. He slept under it. He wrapped it around a boy who had never seen snow and asked, very seriously, whether the Underriver tasted good. He placed it on a dying woman who had asked not to be frightened, and it made her feel like the wind was a person who would sit by her bed and tell her the weather. In a different winter, not as cold as the one with the singing wood, but meaner in the way that grinds, he found himself in a station corridor lined with bodies, and he found his hands cupped under the chin of a Dominion soldier too young for the metal he wore. Jonah pressed water to the soldier's mouth and did not call him dog. The boy looked at the human with the blanket with the threads and said in a voice more confused than afraid, "Why?" Jonah did not say, "Because we are better." He said, "Because we endure." The boy didn't know yet what that word meant. He would learn. When he closed his eyes at night, Jonah saw the pillar's reflection again, himself, older, bone-deep, and behind him the valley in summer. He heard the note that had braided itself through the cold morning like a stitch in leather. He heard Ina say, "Carry." And he did, across systems, across wars that were too large and skirmishes that were too small, and stations where the air smelled of oil and onions. A few years later, a report crossed his desk. An Aevril settlement on a planet no Dominion mapmaker had bothered to annotate. An underriver that had become an overriver for a day to swallow a fire. A handful of children who could sing 2 notes at once and laugh while doing it, which is a skill that should be reserved for those who haven't had to learn about ledger books. An attached image showed a wall where names had been written in a hand he recognized. The kid from the valley, older now, writing a human name between 2 Aevril ones in grease pencil. He put his hand on the screen like a fool. He hummed the note at a pitch only people who had frozen once carry as a scar. The wind that touched him through the station's recycled air was not a real wind at all. It was enough. He could have told the story different ways. As forward operating orders, as a disaster report, as a list of necessaries against hypothermia, as a case study in asymmetric ground warfare. People would have learned something from each. He told it the way it had asked to be told, with a blanket and a hand and an old ground that refused to be bought or hurried. In the end, when a council under some other mountain asked him why the humans had chosen to carry, what logic, what stratagem, what ambitious downside, he told them the only answer that did not embarrass the wind. Because someone asked, he said, because we could, because it would have been a worse universe not only for you if we had not. The council shifted in their seats, uncomfortable as men confronted with simplicity often are. A translator cleared his throat. Ina, seated in a corner with her hands folded, allowed her mouth to move into the shape humans call a smile, though to the Aevril it meant, "My hands know they have work they will like." Jonah went home, which is to say he went to the next station, the next patient, the next valley. He slept under the blanket when he could. He sent threads to Ina sometimes, blue and silver, and she wove them into the edge. If anyone asked him why the border of the blanket looked the way it did, he told them, because memory is a seam, not a wall. On the anniversary of the day the underriver had chosen to indulge men for a while, he stood on a deck watching stars that looked like salt spilled on black enamel. He held the blanket like a flag and then like a child. He let the wind from the ventilation make it move, and imagined the wind from the valley was visiting. He hummed a note into a room that didn't care for music, and the room became briefly friendly. He did not conquer anything that night. He did not even manage to stop a bureaucrat from being a bureaucrat the next morning. He went to bed and woke and got up and took his turn, which is how the species had survived deserts and ice and men who wanted straight lines, and how it would keep going, given the chance. When he closed his eyes one last time, years and valleys later, he did not say, "We won." He said, "We carried," and he felt the underriver turn over under him, pleased at last, less alone in the dark. Headphone, if you're enjoying this story, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars. The war didn't end. Wars don't, not the useful ones. They go into remission. They become background and weather. They turn into stories that inform how hands move when a stranger needs water. The Dominion learned to step more carefully over iron ground. The Aevril learned what it means to write names in a language that has letters shaped like ladders. Humanity learned an old word in a new mouth, carry. On a different frontier where the wind came from salt instead of snow, on a ridge where the earth remembered being coral, Jonah found himself standing with a team of med techs in suits that had never met cold, and Aevril singing notes that tasted of sunrise. An old machine buried in the spine of the island woke at the wrong time and asked too loudly for what it wanted. It wanted a harder sky. It wanted the ground to be unkind. The human engineers swore, the Aevril hummed. Jonah introduced them like a man who had learned to make friends on behalf of matter. "Listen," he told the machine, even though machines are not known for their listening, and he set his hand on the coral rock as if it were a shoulder. "Listen to what we're carrying." The machine had been made by men who did not understand how to admit a thing doesn't belong to them. It had learned to hate being turned off. It had a petty streak you only see in old code. It tried to take. The coral turned under it, a living thing humans had been too careless near for too long. The underriver here was not water or memory, it was pressure and the memory of shells. Jonah hummed. The Aevril braided their notes around his. The machine hesitated, as if embarrassed to be so loud in a room of people using the indoor voice of humility. It backed down. It did not die. Why should it? It learned the shape of the blanket separated from the body it warmed, saw the blue and silver thread, decided to want different things. Or maybe it didn't decide. Maybe the world did the thing it sometimes does when humans are paying attention. It became easier. After, the Aevril woman who had been leading the singers stepped close to Jonah and touched the hem of the blanket where the thread had been mended and remended with different knots. "You kept it," she said, and he knew she meant more than fabric. "I kept it," he said, "and found you have more arms than you thought," she said, smiling dry. "Keep insulting me like that," he said, "and I'll start thinking I can sing." "You can," she said. "Your kind has been for longer than your kind remembers." He did not argue. He had learned the pointlessness of arguing with either weather or praise. He let the compliment sit in the room until it got comfortable and decided to stay. News came from the valley. A boy had grown. A girl had become a teacher of the old notes and the new. The pillar had begun to dim and brighten in time with the seasons. The underriver had stopped swallowing men who didn't deserve it, and had learned to trick a few who did into a patience they had not been planning on. From other fronts, a Dominion captain refused a bombardment order because his grandmother's mouth had made a shape he later recognized as an Aevril vowel. A human unit knelt in a burned archive and hummed while they lifted ashes into jars labeled with names taken from a portable wall. A set of children, 4 Aevril, 2 human, debated at length the most ethical way of teaching a river to change its course. Somewhere else, farther than men usually like to admit exists, a machine with old code had learned 2 notes and was trying to combine them in the dark. You could pretend this didn't matter. The ledger might allow it. Numbers are kind to liars for a time. You could go on building heavy ships and boots with clever souls and say that history is a story of metal, or you could carry. The second is harder. It is also the only thing that has ever made a universe worth being old in. Months folded into a year like the old blanket folded itself over cold shoulders. Jonah kept moving. The names on the portable wall multiplied. The wall sometimes went everywhere he did. Sometimes it wandered on without him, as things nurtured well enough to leave dew. He did not collect medals. He lost one in a drift of paper one day and laughed, the way a man laughs when a pocket decides to do its own inventory. He collected threads. He stitched them where he could, on a station where the gravity tired at different times of day, lazy in morning, disciplined at night. He sat with Ina in a cafeteria that smelled of salt and fruit and metal. She handed him a cup of something that would have been tea in every story he had ever heard. Here it was made from petals of a plant that had learned to hold taste like a secret. They did not speak of wars or underrivers. They let their hands rest on the table as if the table were a pillar, and for a breath it was. "I'll tell you a human story," Ina said at last. She spoke the language like someone who had been chasing it down corridors until she had learned where it likes to stop and tie its boots. There was a man made small by grief. He thought he could make the grief smaller by forgetting to carry. He went to a place so loud he could not hear himself. The loud place ate his name and asked for more. One day a stranger put a blanket on his shoulders in a wind. It didn't end the grief, it gave it edges. He was grateful for the first time in a long time. That gratitude made him taller. He took his new height to work. Jonah listened. He didn't know if the man was him or a ghost he had hugged by accident. He didn't ask. The point of some stories is not the faces inside them but the hands you feel on your shoulders as the wind passes. "I'll tell you one," he said, and told her about the desert that cooled at night and made even rigid men smarter for a few hours. When the next call came, no voice, only a code. He stood and didn't say, "I am tired." She stood with him and didn't say, "Me too." They both would go. That is not bravery, it's simply the done thing. The way geese turn their necks before flying. On the day the Dominion came to the valley again, with subtler boots and faces that had listened to a few stories, the humans didn't pick up rifles first. They picked up names. They stood in a line that wasn't a line, nothing so confrontational, and they said their mother's names and their father's names, and the names of boys who'd laughed at bad jokes during conditioning, and the names of a planet that had taught them how to endure deserts and ice and bureaucracy. And then they said the names they'd learned to carry. Children with braids threaded in blue, elders who taught cold hands a kind of courage, a river that didn't ask for permission to move. The Dominion men, still young despite more scars, didn't fire. Some of them cocked their heads, the way dogs do when they hear a wind that interests them. Most of them pretended to retighten a strap, because it helps to look busy when you're deciding whether to let a ledger be a map. One of them began to hum accidentally, a thing learned in the shower of all places, decades ago on a ship that had once been a freighter. No line changed on any piece of paper. Somewhere, an admiral decided to shift assets. Somewhere else, a child decided to be a singer instead of a soldier. It all matters less and more than you think. When Jonah died, because we all do, even those of us who think we can outrun breath, he did not do it in a glorious place. He did it in a corridor between rooms while deciding whether to go left or right first. He did it with the blanket under his hands because a friend had laid it there. He did it to the sound of humming, a single note held by people he had taught in the places that taught him. He did it without fuss. The wind, which can't actually fit in station corridors though it has tried to, let him believe for 1 second that it was there, brushing his cheek like a mother who has all the time. Afterward, the blanket became more thread than fabric. It held together because that's what things carried well do. Ina took a small piece of the border and wove it into a pillar in a valley no human would see for a while. A boy who was not a boy anymore took a different small piece and stitched it into a jacket that would smell of oil and rain instead of snow. Mora kept the largest piece in a drawer and took it out to touch when her hands felt like tools. And the story went on. A hand held out under a wind, a command softer than orders, a machine learning shame, a river learning to remember. Other men took credit and got promotions. Let them. The ledger is not the world. The world is the note sung under a dome, a note one species couldn't hold alone because gloom swallows it, but two can keep up and three better, and a chorus makes the underriver roll over like a cat asking to be scratched. No empire ended. No flag was planted on a hill the wind would later dismiss. A blanket was put on shoulders. A sentence began and finished. A man learned to make his face kind when he said, "Turn around." He kept a hand warm enough for a stone to recognize as neighbor, and that was enough, more than enough, to tell every child who would carry more names than their lungs would get credit for that they could continue anyway, one breath, one note, one winter at a time. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.
Yep.